Somewhere on a jacket hanging in a closet right now, there are 3 letters stamped on a tiny piece of metal. Most people have touched the same metal 10,000 times and never once looked at it. 10 billion. That is how many zippers this company produces every single year. 317 every second, around the clock, every day. More than any other manufacturer on Earth. That company is YKK, Yoshida Kogyo Kabushiki Gaisha. It controls roughly 40% of the entire global zipper market by value. Almost none of its customers have ever heard the name. Nike, Adidas, Levi's, Patagonia, Uniqlo, these are the names that show up on the labels. The company holding their products together is a name almost none of their customers ever learn. It barely advertises to consumers. No commercials, no celebrity deals, no Super Bowl spots. It sells entirely to other businesses, and the people buying the final product never see its name. A failed zipper is not just an inconvenience. In premium apparel, one publicly failed fastener on a flagship product can end a brand's relationship with a major retailer permanently. The story of how one company made itself so deeply embedded in global manufacturing that switching away from it carried financial and operational risk for any brand that tried. But this company is not coasting. A Chinese rival is closing the quality gap faster than anyone in Japan expected, and nobody in Kurobe knows how it ends. The story starts in 1934, with a failed businessman, a borrowed idea, and a quiet workshop in Tokyo. Tadao Yoshida was born in 1906 in Kurobe, Toyama. His father traveled the countryside collecting birds. Tadao grew up far from any factory floor, with no engineering background and no obvious path toward industry. Before the zipper shop, Yoshida had already tried and failed at multiple small ventures. He was no inventor, just a stubborn man who kept trying until something stuck. In January 1934, at 31 years old, he opened a tiny zipper shop in Tokyo's Nihonbashi district and called it San-es Shokai. He had no proprietary technology, no investors, no edge. What he had was a refusal to ship a zipper he wasn't satisfied with. The global zipper market in 1934 was already owned by an American company called Talon. They had refined the sliding fastener to commercial scale decades earlier and were generations ahead of anyone in Asia. Yoshida did something straightforward. He studied Talon's products carefully, copied the mechanisms that worked, and then looked for every small improvement he could build on top. One early difference: Yoshida switched from copper to aluminum in his fastener teeth. A small material choice, but it made his products lighter and slightly cheaper to produce than what Talon was shipping. From the beginning, Yoshida paid his workers above the standard going rate. He believed a company that systematically underpaid its people was spending down an asset that wouldn't show up on any balance sheet, and he kept that policy for the rest of his life. By 1939, Japan was sliding toward war. Civilian demand for clothing accessories collapsed almost overnight. The company had customers disappearing and no clear path to replacing them. To survive, he pivoted the entire operation toward wartime naval supply, producing zippers and small metal components for the Japanese Imperial Navy. The pivot wasn't planned, but it kept the company alive. In February 1942, the business formalized into a limited corporation under the name Yoshida Kogyo. A bureaucratic step during a war, but the first moment the company existed in a fully legal sense. Then came the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945. American B-29s firebombed Tokyo in one of the most destructive conventional air raids in history. In a single night, large sections of the city's working districts burned to the ground. Yoshida's factory burned with the rest of the district. The machines he'd spent years acquiring, the tooling jigs, the customer order records, supplier contacts, every physical asset the company owned. All of it gone in one night. He was 39 years old, with 11 years of work reduced to rubble and a country in total freefall around him, no insurance and no plan. Most people who lived through that night never rebuilt anything. Yoshida gathered what little remained and traveled back to Kurobe, the mountain town he'd grown up in. Going home was a survival decision, not a strategic one. In January 1946, with the country still under Allied occupation and the economy in pieces, he registered a new trademark. 3 letters, YKK, he was starting from nothing, and he knew it. He did not come back alone. Workers who had survived the war came with him to Kurobe to start again. The post-war rebuild of YKK was not one man's story. It was a factory floor full of people who had nowhere else to go and decided to build something instead. Post-war Japan desperately needed clothing, work gear, tents, bags, almost everything needed fasteners. In the wreckage, demand for functional zipper supply was immediate, and Yoshida had walked into the right ruins. The equipment was minimal. Early YKK zippers were assembled largely by hand. The quality reflected it. They jammed. They split. They were the kind of product a buyer used once and remembered with frustration. Japanese manufacturing broadly carried a bad reputation overseas at this point, seen as cheap and unreliable against anything from America or Europe. YKK carried that stigma, whether it deserved it or not. Yoshida understood the problem precisely. The product cannot be fixed without fixing the machine, and the machine cannot be fixed while depending on an outside supplier for it. In 1050, he imported an automated chain-making machine from the United States. Industrial equipment capable of running assembly cycles no human hand could match. But Yoshida didn't just run the machine. He had his engineers take it apart completely, map every component, and then rebuild it faster and more precise than the original, better suited to zipper production specifically. Most zipper manufacturers in the world buy the machines they run from outside vendors. YKK had just crossed a line almost none of them would. They started building their own machines in-house from scratch. The redesigned machine entered full production by 1953, and quality improved almost immediately. YKK zippers stopped jamming, consistency held across batches, and the bad reputation began to crack. Then the Korean War drove zinc and copper prices to crisis levels. Raw material costs for every zipper manufacturer on Earth spiked sharply. Competitors scrambled. Yoshida asked a different question. The question was, why are we still dependent on anyone else for our materials? YKK's team developed a proprietary aluminum alloy called 56S, lighter, durable, and cheaper to produce than what it replaced. And then Yoshida pushed further. If they could build their own machines and develop their own alloys, why not smelt their own brass entirely? So they did. Raw copper and zinc melted down in their own foundries to 99.98% purity. That molten brass ribbon gets rolled flat, stamped, then cut into the parts every zipper needs: teeth, slider, stops. All of it happens without leaving the building. Most zipper companies buy the machines on their factory floors. The companies that build those machines source the parts inside them. The mills that supply those parts ship brass from somewhere else. YKK is the one company in this chain that owns almost every step. They smelt the metal and build the machines for in-house use across the chain. They stamp the teeth on the same site from start to finish. A closed production loop nobody else in the industry has matched. To close the loop, YKK developed an internal stress test that subjected each zipper design to 10,000 open and closed cycles before any commercial approval. Most competitors tested nowhere near that threshold, and most of them were also losing clients to YKK. By the early 1950s, every domestic Japanese rival had been left behind. YKK was the unambiguous market leader at home. Yoshida wanted the rest of the world. In 1955, a purpose-built plant opened in Kurobe, and in 1958 headquarters moved to Asakusa, Tokyo. That same year, YKK introduced the conceal zipper, its teeth completely hidden inside the fabric seam. Fashion designers responded immediately. A hidden fastener meant cleaner silhouettes, and it gave YKK something no competitor could undercut on price, since price had nothing to do with what made the product work. In January 1959, YKK opened its first overseas operation in New Zealand. A modest beginning, but the signal was clear. Yoshida intended to put YKK's name on clothing on every continent. While YKK was planting its first overseas flag in 1959, coastal China was a quieter picture. Manufacturing towns like Xinjiang in Fujian province were barely industrialized. Kurobe wasn't watching the coast. In 1960, a small YKK subsidiary opened in Manhattan's Garment District. Salespeople walked door to door with sample cases, pitching American clothing manufacturers one at a time. Slow, unglamorous, effective. The strategy everywhere was the same. Do not just export the product. Build a complete self-contained factory in every market. Bring the machines from Kurobi. Replicate the supply chain from scratch. Hit the same quality bar as the home plant. Through the 1960s, factories opened in Latin America, North America, then Europe. By the end of that decade, YKK had become a global manufacturing operation with no single point of failure, and still no name recognition among the people wearing its products. Meanwhile, Talon, the American company that had invented the modern zipper, was still technically the global leader into the mid-1960s, but the position was beginning to show its age. Talon's problem wasn't one bad call. It was the slow drift that comes from decades of dominance and no serious challenger. They started treating their lead like an inheritance instead of something they still had to earn. YKK's combination of lower prices and equal or better quality was nearly impossible to defend against without reinvestment. Talon had not been reinvesting. They had been protecting margins. By 1980, the shift was complete. YKK overtook Talon to become the largest zipper manufacturer on the planet. A company that had not existed until 1934 now led an industry the other firm had defined. Talon's decline after that was steep. By the early 2000s, its U.S. market share had collapsed from dominance to roughly 7%. The company had not been beaten in a single decisive moment. It had been made irrelevant, slowly and then all at once. Talon had invented the modern zipper and still lost. Creating something does not guarantee ownership of it forever, since dominance has to be maintained or it erodes underneath the incumbent while the profits are still being counted. Tadao Yoshida never spoke about any of this in the language of conquest. He built the company around a philosophy he called the cycle of goodness, a simple idea with operational consequences. Strip it down, a company that hoards profit starves the system that produces it. The benefit has to flow outward, to customers, suppliers, workers, and the towns the factories sit in. He backed it with documented behavior. In every country YKK entered, the company paid workers above local market rates, not as charity, as a deliberate expression of the belief that treating labor as disposable builds disposable work. In 1993, Tadahiro Yoshida became the second president, taking over a company built from ash and stubbornness. He did not change the philosophy. He updated the language to fit a world the founder had not lived to see. By the 1990s, YKK held roughly half the global zipper market. 45,000 employees ran factories on every inhabited continent. Almost no consumer anywhere recognized the name. Brands like Levi's, Patagonia, and Uniqlo had built YKK into their supply chains as a non-negotiable spec without ever telling their customers. Not advertising to consumers was not an oversight. It was a business model. Now go back to that quiet coastal China moment. In 1984, in Xinjiang, Fujian province, a company called SBS Zipper opened its doors. Kurobi was not paying attention. SBS grew anyway. SBS started with price competition. It targeted the fast fashion brands that YKK considered beneath its premium tier and offered them adequate zippers at a fraction of the cost. The playbook kept working through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The explosion of fast fashion in the 2000s and 2010s created a market tier that had barely existed before. Shein, H&M, Zara, and their competitors didn't need the world's best zipper. They needed the world's cheapest acceptable one. SBS owned that tier. SBS didn't stop at cheap. They started building internal research teams, filing patents, investing in vertical integration, and studying with great care the playbook of the company they were trying to unseat. Yoshida studied Talon's machines in the 1930s, copied the parts that worked, and built on top. 40 years later, a small factory in Fujian did the same thing to YKK. Different decade, different coast, same playbook. YKK had spent decades watching European and American competition. The company that actually caught up came from a direction nobody in Kurobe had been looking. By the mid-2020s, SBS had filed hundreds of patents and built a research operation the industry could no longer dismiss as a price cutter. The quality gap was measurably narrowing, and the people in Kurobe knew it. Patent infringement lawsuits have flown in both directions between Japan and China across the zipper trade. Neither company has backed down, and the litigation is ongoing. Longtime YKK clients have begun diversifying their supplier base. They're not abandoning YKK outright. They're hedging, placing some volume with SBS to avoid full dependence on a single source. Dominance rarely ends with a crash. It ends with 100 small decisions like this one. By value, YKK still leads. Nike and Adidas reportedly source 70 to 80% of their zippers from YKK, and the premium tier is holding. The honest question is how long that tier stays insulated from a rival that keeps improving. Geopolitics has entered the picture too. Tariff disputes and rising economic nationalism complicate supply chains at every level, including something as small as zipper teeth. EKK's global network, once purely an asset, now navigates political friction in multiple markets. Industry analysts have started asking something that seemed absurd 10 years ago. Could YKK eventually be pushed out of the Chinese market by a combination of regulatory pressure and local preference? Nobody has a confident answer. The unease in Kurobe isn't panic. It's a specific recognition. YKK now occupies the same position Talon held around 1965, still leading and being chased, with a clear view of what happened to the last company in that position. YKK's response has been to push harder on the things that built the lead in the first place. More R&D, more patents, and a serious move into sustainability as a dimension purely price-driven rivals can't easily follow. One concrete product, Talon zippers made partly from recycled plastic bottles, aim directly at the sustainability-driven brands reshaping fashion industry supply chain requirements. Another move, aggressive automation across global factories. The labor cost advantage that made Chinese manufacturing structurally cheaper for 2 decades is narrowing, and automation is how YKK is compressing the gap further. The hardest thing to steal is the knowledge that cannot be written down. 9 decades of understanding how to build the machines behind every zipper. A product can be reverse engineered, but the reason each component is shaped exactly the way it is cannot. A multi-billion-dollar industrial rivalry, a supply chain that touches almost every garment on Earth, and at the center of it all, a piece of stamped metal that most people never look at twice. This company rebuilt from literal ashes in 1945. It rebuilt from market irrelevance against Talon by 1980. It's now in the middle of a third test, and the outcome of this one isn't settled. Tadao Yoshida started with one borrowed idea from an American company, one small shop in Tokyo, and one belief. A company that owns the machine owns the product. That single conviction built everything that followed. Next time a jacket gets zipped, look at the pull tab. The 3 letters stamped there are easy to miss, and they were always meant to be. If it says YKK, what's in the hand is 90 years of ash, reinvention, stubborn conviction, the part nobody looks at is the part that cannot be allowed to fail.